Key concept 3.1 is basically about trade networks growing and trade increasing and more contact within people and more diffusion of certain things really taking place. So the first point is that there's more technology and there are different practices going on that increase trade. So the new trade routes and existing trade routes, there are new trade routes and the existing trade routes grew. And so there are more cities and there's more trade just in general. And what really affects that trade is the new technology. So things that were like the astrolabe and things that were more about the workers, like unions, and then things that just made trade easier, like new forms of money. So they had like paper money and checks and credit and things like that. But that trade really affected things like ideas and more of those innovations being spread, so trade increased even more. The second one is about mostly migration, so things like the Bantu migration, the Polynesian migration. They spread things like language, and they caused environmental effects, and they spread a lot of techniques like agricultural techniques and things like ironworking. The third one is that in addition to the existing trade routes growing, there were also new trade networks, and Islam was also developed, which really affected that because the person who founded it, Muhammad, was a merchant. So merchants were really protected and trade was protected under Islam. And since Islam grew so much, that really helped with the trade routes and it really increased trade. In addition to this, there were more things like diasporic communities, and just overall, there was more diffusion of technology and diffusion of just ideas. So there was more technology and science and things like that. So also for Islam, there were syncretic faiths, and um, for the syncretic faiths, it would be things like Islam spreading, but if it spread to a certain region, the people in that region would adopt Islam, but also keep some of their own religious beliefs along with Islam. The fourth one is about the diffusion of crops and pathogens. So the big one is the bubonic plague because that spread all throughout Europe and all throughout Asia and it killed so many people. And that spread because of trade routes, because so many people were interacting, it was a lot easier for diseases to spread. And then crops were spread through things like the Bantu migration, the Polynesian migration, and just the trading of people. Next, we have some vocabulary for each unit. The first one is things like the astrolabe, caravanserai, credit, and trade organizations, and infrastructure. So these are all things that sort of increase trade, whether they're like innovations or state-sponsored infrastructure, like the things that the government put in place to increase trade, whether it's just within one state or across regions. And then for 3.12, these are more things, well, like longships are the new type of boat by the Vikings, which like help their ability to travel because it could go into deep or shallow waters, so it kind of made them more efficient. And then there are just a lot of people, and this, like Swahili is a language, but the Berbers and Bantu people are people that were like living in Africa, and that had an effect on trade because people trade with them now, especially since they develop more technology and more adaptations to allow them to trade more easily and to get to places more easily. And then three, it's mostly about Islam because that was the big thing that was developed that affected trade because of the protection of merchants and things like that. And then also the travelers in this unit, in this key concept, they would go around and a lot of them would write about their experiences and we could kind of see what they thought and see more about the developing world. And it showed that trade routes they could travel through the trade routes easily and that they could get around. Then the last one, it's about bubonic plague and champa rice, which are both things that were spread, and bubonic plague is an epidemic disease. So there were all three things that spread along those trade routes. And then urbanization is something that happened in cities. So like champa rice, which was something that was spread by the Grand Canal in China. Since the rice was quick ripening, it increased population, and people would like move to cities because that was where trade was happening, and that was where they could influence trade and trade their goods and trade with other people for other people's goods. So you could see a big increase in urbanization at this time. Primary documents in this time period, you can see Ibn Battuta, who was one of those travelers. You can see his writings, and then the spread of Buddhism, because that was again like a religion that was spread in this time period through trade routes and through conquest. Helpful videos of Islam, because that's something big that happens in this key concept. And then some of this evidence, astrolabe and Grand Canal, both things that facilitated trade. Astrolabe was more of a navigational thing, whereas the Grand Canal was just in China, but it helped that champa rice, and so it helped their population, and it increased trade in China since it could now go from north to south. 3.12, it has a camel saddle, which was something that increased trade in sub-Saharan Africa because it would be easier to navigate the desert. And then bananas, which were bred in Africa because mostly of the Bantu migrations. Next one, Islam. That's something really important in this key concept because of the trade and because it was just a new religion, and it had a very big empire. And Ibn Battuta, who was the traveler that we could see his writings from, he was also Muslim. The fourth point is of the bubonic plague and champa rice, which were both things that were spread just because of trade routes, and champa rice because of the Grand Canal. Some maps. This is of the Bantu migration, which was talked about before, and the second one, you can see at the bottom, is of the bubonic plague, where that spread, and it was spread because of both the trade routes and the Mongols, because they really got around to Europe and Asia and everywhere, and they really helped that disease to spread, and it could spread more easily because once again there was more contact between people, especially with the Mongols, since they would take over so many cities and also use plague victims as biological weapons. And that's all.